Hey everyone, and welcome back to Psych 4100 Cognitive Psychology. In this lecture, we will be going over Chapter 11, which is on language. So, some questions that we're going to want to consider across this chapter. How do people understand individual words, and how do words combine to create sentences and thus meaning? How can we understand sentences that are sort of ambiguous in their meaning, or words that are ambiguous in their meaning? How do we resolve this ambiguity? How do we understand stories and sort of sequences and scripts? And are there any connections between language and music, which in and of itself is a really interesting area of study? Okay, so let's define language. Language is a system of communication using sounds or symbols. So that means language can be auditory, right? Sound, or it can be written as symbols. And it's this system that allows us to express feelings, thoughts, ideas, and experiences. And the key here is in a creative way. So there are two more than two, but two or three major aspects of human language that make it different from animal communication. So, um, I mean, many, if not most, animals communicate in some way. Right? Dogs bark, cats meow, bumblebees actually dance to communicate the location of flowers to their hive mates. There's all kinds of incredible variety of communication in the animal world, but none of it is language, because language involves symbolic representation, whether that's through sounds or written symbols, that use structure and rules in a flexible and creative way to produce essentially an unlimited, vast possibility of ideas that can be communicated. So, while a dog barking could mean it's excited, it's hungry, it's angry, it's scared, right? It can mean a few things. It's incredibly limited in its ability to flexibly communicate. And there aren't really definable rules that govern something like dog barking. Whereas a human language has a basically infinite number of ideas that can be communicated, because language is flexible and creative in its use of these representative symbols. So this rests upon two major sort of systems that we can think about. The fact that human language is hierarchical, meaning that smaller components are combined to form larger, more meaningful units. So letters combine into words, words combine into phrases, phrases make up sentences, sentences make up paragraphs, so on and so forth. They sort of build upon each other. There are discrete elements that fit within this larger hierarchy of communication, such that you can have a sequence of letters, words, phrases, and sentences that might be identical. So let's say a sequence of two identical sentences. But if you place them within different paragraphs, or you place those paragraphs within different books or chapters, then the meaning, or the context of the information around it completely changes the meaning, because of this hierarchical nested system. You can have an identical sentence. I'm just going to come up with something off the top of my head. Hey, who are you? Right? Hey, comma, who are you? Can have many different implications and can communicate different ideas based upon sort of its situation in this hierarchical structure. So, hey, who are you? Could be curious, it could be threatening, it could be just uh, neutral and informative, because it can be nested in different places within this hierarchy. And of course, there are rules that govern the specific components of language and the way that we arrange them. There are many different sort of subfields of study in how we govern language with these rules. You're probably most familiar with things like grammar and syntax, but there are other subfields such as phonology, which is really the study of sound. So, how we produce the sounds that make language, and what are the implications of those sounds. So, there's really a lot that goes into these rules that govern our use of language. Um, One incredibly important point to make that is really interesting about human language is that it appears to be universal, meaning that all people that we know of who uh, develop normal human capacities within a normal human social structure will learn language and will learn to follow its complex rules. Every culture that we know of has language. It doesn't always have to be written, right? Not all cultures will develop or have developed written language, but all known cultures have spoken language, just like not everyone knows how to read or write, right? You can be what we call illiterate, but you can still use language, you can still speak and understand. One really interesting point is that when left to their own devices, deaf children will actually invent sign languages all on their own. There are a couple of really famous examples of this, sort of prior to formal instruction in things like deaf schools. Children were sent, children who were deaf were sent to boarding schools, and developed their own languages there. Um, Language development is similar across culture, meaning sort of the sequence and pattern of learning words, of learning grammar, of putting together 2 or 3 or 4 word sentences. These things are very similar across cultures, even if the language is not similar. And sort of to that point, languages are unique, but follow these same structures. So while the words, the sounds, and the rules can be different, so for example, in Spanish and Hebrew, nouns have genders, right? There are male nouns and female nouns, whereas in English, our nouns are not gendered, they're without gender. So there are clearly differences between languages, right? But all languages have the same general structure. They all have nouns and verbs, negatives, questions, tenses that tell us about time, right? Past, present, future. So languages really share some common core elements that speak to their universality across human time as well as human culture. So in cognitive psychology, the study of language can be traced back really to behaviorists such as B.F. Skinner, who argued things like that language is learned through reinforcement. Children start to produce language, they're rewarded for that behavior. Maybe they get praise or they get attention, or they start to sort of interact with the world in a positive and reinforcing way. And so that's how they learn language. However, there was sort of a separate school of thought founded by Noam Chomsky, who claimed that human language is much more basic in human DNA and what it means to be human. He was really a proponent of this idea of structural sameness amongst languages. And his idea is that the production of language and the general structures of language are actually innate to human beings. We don't have to do anything. We don't have to be taught language. In fact, if you look at sort of traditional societies in the world, like hunter gatherer societies, they don't spend a whole lot of time sitting down and teaching children language like we tend to do sort of in the modern Western world. If you're a hunter gatherer, you do very little of sitting down with an ABCs book or teaching your child what noises animals make and the names of those animals. What children tend to do is just learn and pick up language as it's naturally occurring around them. And they sort of Chomsky had this idea that language being heard around a child sort of awakens the sort of natural innate nature of language that's within them and is sort of ready to go. It just needs the right input. And Chomsky made the point that language cannot be exclusively learned through reinforcement because children produce novel sentences. Children will, as they start to learn words and increase the vocabulary, they can begin to apply these structures and rules of language on their own. They don't have to be taught. And they start to produce their own novel sentences. And furthermore, one of I think the more interesting things about language development are the errors that children make. And the errors that children make actually give us a window into their learning of language. So children will often make errors of plurality or tense. When, like in English, you have lots of irregular, for example, verbs. So the present tense of the word run, right, is run or running. The past tense is irregular. It's ran, R-A-N. Typically, the sort of regular rule for making something past tense is to add an ed to the end of it, right? Ed makes something past tense. And children learn that very early. They pick up on the fact that if I want to make something past tense, add an ed to the end of it. So children will begin to make errors like I runned yesterday, right? R-U-N-N-E-D. That's not a word. It's not an English word. And it's probably not something that children hear adults say ever, right? If at all. I runned outside yesterday. But children will produce that language, will produce that error on their own because it shows they're learning the rules of the language and they're trying to apply those rules to the words that they know. And what they then have to do is explicitly learn the words that have irregularities in their sort of composition. So this gave rise to this sort of early battle between Skinner and Chomsky, gave rise to a subfield of psychology known as psycholinguistics, right? So psycho meaning psychology, linguistics, the study of language. And the purpose of this field was to discover the psychological process by which humans acquire and process language. So there are a few main components to psycholinguistics. It wants to understand how people comprehend language, how they understand the language of others. We want to understand how people produce their own language, both the physical, so meaning the phonological, the sounds of language, as well as the mechanics of written language, the physical production of language, and the mental processes associated with speech production. How we represent language in the mind, representation, and then, of course, acquisition, how we learn language. So we're going to start at sort of the sort of bottom part of this hierarchy of psycholinguistics and understanding language. We're going to begin with how we understand words. So we have a few definitions that we need to kind of get out of the way. A lexicon is all the words a person can understand. So all the words that a person understands is called their lexicon. Semantics is our understanding of the meaning of language and words. The meaning of language, and then lexical semantics is how we understand the meaning of words. And sort of maybe most confusing is that words can have more than one meaning. So a real big question in our understanding of words is how do people deal with the fact that words can have multiple meanings, and that the exact meaning of a word might not be clear at, for example, the beginning of a sentence. So, what are some factors that complicate our understanding of words? Um, well, word frequency is a really big factor in how we understand words. And there's an effect called the word frequency effect, in which we are faster to respond to high frequency words. And this is occurring in what's known as a lexical decision task. It's pretty straightforward. A lexical decision task, you see a series of letters on a screen, and you have to decide, is this string of letters a word or not a word? Right? Make a decision about whether it's a word or not a word. Yes or no? Well, maybe not surprisingly, the more frequent a word occurs in language, the faster we are to identify it. So the word, I don't know, car is quite frequent in language, but the word maybe spatula is significantly less frequent in language. So when we see the sequence of letters CAR, we very quickly respond to it and correctly identify it as a word. But when we see the sequence of letters that spell spatula, it takes us more time to process because we're not as familiar with that word. Furthermore, when we're reading, we do a very similar thing. As our eyes move across a page, we actually look at low frequency words for a longer amount of time, presumably because they require more processing. They're more unfamiliar to us. So word frequency is a big factor in the way that we comprehend and understand words, either quickly or words that require more processing. I think a really interesting factor is variable word pronunciation. So this comes into play in sort of the everyday informal way that we speak to each other. And this can also come into play as people have different manners of speaking, such as accents. It would be quite common to hear someone say the sound "did you," right? Didjoo, did you? And we all kind of understand that to be the phrase "did you," right? DID space YOU, right? Two words there. Did you? But if you were just like talking to your friend, you're not probably going to like explicitly enunciate every single sound that you say, right? You're going to say, "Hey, did you get that?" Right? "Did you pick up milk from the grocery store?" You're not going to say, "Did you pick up milk?" Right? Or lots of people are going to say the phrase "gonna," right? "Oh, we're gonna leave in an hour," even though that's not a word. It's a variable pronunciation of going to, right? We're going to. And what's interesting is that we can perfectly well understand these variable word pronunciations, typically by using Context. Um, we use context a lot in language, as we'll see and talk about. But the context within which these variable pronunciations occur, even unfamiliar pronunciations, we can figure out kind of on the fly what that person means and how we should interpret it. So here's just some quick evidence for the word frequency effect. Here we can see that low frequency words, so words that are uncommon, have longer fixation durations, meaning we look at them longer as we're reading, than do high frequency words. So, one thing that's sort of related to variable word pronunciation is the idea of speech segmentation. This is our ability to sort of parse where one word begins and another word ends. And it's actually quite remarkable that we can do this so easily, because typically people don't produce these like large, dramatic, uh, explicit pauses and silences between spoken words. So if I were to say the phrase pretty baby, right? Pretty baby, they just, from a sound perspective, from a phonological perspective, the words roll right into each other. How does your brain know that you're not saying pre tib abbey, right? Like that's just, it's the same noises, right? Pretty baby. They all sort of run together. But what happens is that we become familiar with the frequency of words in conversation, right? Pretty and baby are common words. We use context to know where we should parse those words. And then we use some of these syntactic rules as well as statistical learning over time to understand what those maybe ambiguous sounds should be interpreted as. So, for example, the phrases "big girl" and "big Earl" um, actually produce the exact same phonology, the exact same sound, right? So, big girl, big girl, right? When I produce these two phrases, if we were to feed them into a computer, they sound exactly the same, right? I'm producing the exact same noises when I say these phrases. Yet, when they're used in a sentence, most people have no problem understanding if you're praising a child for being a big girl versus calling her by the name Big Earl, right? Or if you're at a biker bar and you call out to your friend Big Earl, people don't confuse that with calling out for a big girl, right? So we use context, we use syntactic rules, we use sort of statistical learning of which words are common, which words go together, which words occur together often in language. And we're capable of using this larger context of our words to understand and to seamlessly sort of calculate all of these sort of different understandings of language really on the fly, right? You're not really doing any of this. Your brain just takes over and makes sure that you're getting the appropriate information. Another problem we solve using context and statistical learning is lexical ambiguity. The fact that words often have multiple meanings. So the word bug can mean an insect, it can mean a computer bug, it can mean to like nag someone, right? So the exact same word, bug, can have multiple meanings, and we just use context to tell us to figure out which one is the appropriate one. And what's interesting is that some early psycholinguistic experiments show us that when people hear one of these ambiguous words, what your brain does is activate all of the possible meanings of that word, and then it compares those meanings to the context, and it chooses the meaning that is most likely to be correct. So, uh, a priming experiment was used to sort of test out this theory. So here we have the ambiguous word rose. So she held a rose, right? Where rose is the word rose is referring to a flower, or they all rose, where the word rose is referring to people maybe standing up in the past. And what we find is differences in the way that people respond to these two conditions based upon whether the prime of flower was consistent with the use of the word, as in the first sentence, or inconsistent with the use of the word, as in the second sentence. So when there's zero delay from the prime, we actually see similar performance between she held a rose and they all rose. And then when there's a delay between the sentence and the prime, we see differential performance. What this basically tells us is that immediately when you hear the word, your brain activates both possible meanings of the word rose. And very quickly, in something like 200 milliseconds, your brain has already figured out which meaning of that word is the appropriate one to use. So one of the other things that helps us understand ambiguous words is meaning dominance. Some words have a biased dominance, meaning that one meaning of the word is more common than another meaning of the word. It's biased. So, for example, it's probably more common for people to encounter the word cast, C-A-S-T, as like a thing that gets put on your wrist when you break it, right, so that it can heal. What's much less common for people to encounter is the word cast in reference to casting out a line from a fishing pole while you're going fishing. And so when we hear the word cast, our linguistic systems sort of err on the side of the most common meaning, right? They're, in a sense, biased towards a dominant meaning of that word. But then other words are more balanced, such that words like tin have about equal sort of usage in language of the ambiguous meanings of that word. The two most common meanings of that word being tin as in the metal that's named tin, and then tin as in like a something you can put other things in, right? A holder of items. And so when we have um, context, right? So here we're comparing if there's no prior context, then competition between equally likely meanings of a word with balanced dominance results in slow access, whereas activation of the most frequent meaning of a word with biased dominance results in fast access. Okay, so that's sort of how a little bit about how we go through processes of understanding words. But of course, things get more complicated than that. We take words and we put them into sentences. And so when we start talking about sentences, then we have a few more issues that come up, or a few more things to study. Semantics, so the meaning of words and sentences, right? What are the ideas that we're trying to get across? Ideas can obviously occur at the level of a word, but ideas are more common and ideas are more complex at the level of sentences. Syntax are the rules we use for combining these words into sentences. And parsing, just like we need to be able to parse words, we need to be able to parse words into phrases that create meaning within sentences. And what's interesting is obviously sentences are just strings of words in a sequence. And when you begin a sentence, you don't know where it's going, right? You don't know where it's going to end up. It's like, and we're going to see in a couple slides, there's a theory of sentence understanding called the garden path. Because imagine you're walking through a dense, heavily sort of manicured garden, and you're following this little stone path that takes a big curve around to the left. If you're standing in the path looking, you don't know where that curve goes. You can only see as much of the path as you can see. And the same thing is with a sentence. You can only understand as much of a sentence as you have heard or seen. The end of the sentence might change everything. And so it's really quite remarkable how we can, in the moment, be processing, for example, the first half of a sentence, and then shift and change our understanding of that sentence based on the second half, and maybe have to reinterpret the first half of the sentence as we do so. So we have a sort of difficult sentence to comprehend at first here on the left. After the musician played the piano, she left the stage. So after the musician played is sort of a maybe an obvious place to sort of start a new idea. And then we get the piano, she left the stage, right? So when you hear after the musician played, you have this sort of idea number one. Okay, this sentence is about a musician who has finished performing. You don't know what's happening in the second half of the sentence until the piano, she left the stage. And now you can sort of put the first half of the sentence together to the second half of the sentence. Right? After the musician played the piano, she left the stage. So, like I mentioned previously, we can have things like garden path sentences, those that begin by appearing to mean one thing, but they end up taking a left or a right hand turn and meaning something else. And part of this is due to temporary ambiguity in the beginning of a sentence, where it might not be clear what the words at the beginning of a sentence mean until we get to the end of a sentence. So let's take a similar sentence. After the musicians played the piano, was wheeled off stage. That sounds a little funny to say at first, but it's a perfectly fine sentence, right? There's nothing wrong with this. After the musicians played the piano, was wheeled off stage. So in this sentence, the first one, after the musician played the piano, she left the stage. Your brain needs to parse after the musician played the piano as sort of one segment that has a meaning, and then a second segment of the sentence, she left the stage, as providing additional meaning. The hard part about this sentence is that the partitioning of meaning occurs earlier. After the musicians played, there we need to have a partition of meaning. the piano was wheeled off stage. So after the musicians played, right, they're done playing, then the piano was wheeled off stage. There's nothing wrong with that sentence, just its parsing of it falls in kind of a goofy place, potentially. And so we just have to use some sort of rules, some heuristics about how we group words into phrases. This is often a problem in the use of language, particularly maybe in an academic setting in school, because you can write a sentence that is a perfectly correct sentence, right? There's nothing wrong with the sentence, but maybe the way you have framed it leads to temporary ambiguity and this sort of issue of a garden path where the reader doesn't know where to parse the sentence. And so it ends up causing difficulty in comprehension, even if the sentence is perfectly grammatically correct. And so we have a sort of combination way of understanding how to approach parsing these sentences. And one way that we do this is called a constraint-based approach. It says that we use syntax, word meaning, sort of broader story context, as well as uh, sort of how much of a memory load we can keep in mind all at once in order to understand how to parse sentences. So, one of the next factors in how we understand sentences is context, story context. Um, there was some really cool work done back in the mid 90s that took advantage of what was called the visual world paradigm that they created, which created sort of a visual context of a scene. And they were investigating the way that people maybe changed their interpretation of the information they were given, of the sentences they were given, based upon the non linguistic visual contextual information of a scene. And so, what they end up finding is that people combine both the linguistic as well as the non linguistic information when trying to understand sentences and sort of bringing in really a whole lot of context. So, for example, people were shown an image like this one on the left, and their eye movements were tracked. So we can, like this image on the right, we can see different fixation points, right? Fixation point 1 to the apple, 2 to the towel, 3 back to the apple, 4 to this box. And what these researchers tested was whether people got an ambiguous sentence, place the apple on the towel in the box. The reason this is ambiguous is because place the apple on the towel, period, could be a perfectly fine sentence, right? And there's already an apple on the towel, but place the apple on the towel sort of leaves the reader hanging, right? You don't know what's coming next until you read in the box. Okay, now I know. Place. Okay, I'm going to take the apple that's on the towel and put it in the box. It's made more ambiguous by having multiple towels here, right? So this sentence is just a little bit confusing to people when it pops up given this visual. And what we find is that people often make incorrect eye movements. So, for example, this eye movement sequence shows the ambiguity that people have because, in order to complete the task of this sentence, place the apple on the towel in the box, um, there's no need to look at this other towel unless you're like kind of uncertain or confused about what's going on. Is it asking me to move this apple to this towel? And so people kind of look at the apple, look at the towel, look back. Oh no, it's asking me to move it to the box. So you get a quote unquote incorrect eye movement because of the ambiguity of the sentence. Whereas an unambiguous sentence, place the apple that's on the towel into the box, is much more clear. Right? The apple that's on the towel is sort of this indicator that makes the sentence completely unambiguous. It's now obvious what the instructions are and what you want to be done. And so we see that people make almost zero incorrect eye movements to these unambiguous sentences. And of course, we can control that, right, by um, doing experiments with like multiple apples. We can see here the proportion of trials in which eye movements were made to the towel on the right. For the ambiguous sentence, place the apple on the towel in the box, and the unambiguous sentence, place the apple that's on the towel in the box. People might move to this apple first upon hearing place the apple, but that's still a correct movement, right? Then up to this apple, okay, the apple that's on the towel into the box. So this sort of addition of this other potentially correct eye movement shows that people start tracking, especially objects, right, that they see in the world. People start tracking the objects that they hear about, and thus see in the world at the beginning of the sentence, right? Place the apple. People immediately start looking at an apple on the towel. Okay, it's the other apple into the box. And so we can show this sort of correct sequential movement of eyes to combine the information from the sentence with the information from the visual world. So place the apple, we already get eye movement. On the towel, we get additional eye movement. In the box, we get the final eye movement. So the next thing we want to discuss is our next level of hierarchy, which is understanding things like stories or larger bodies of text. So we've gone from words to sentences to sort of parsing sentences and words to now how do we understand larger orders of magnitude of meaning, like conversations and stories. So representation of the text in one's mind is known as coherence. Coherence is clear relations between parts of the text and the story's main topic. Sorry about this. I guess I flubbed a little typo or something here on my slide. We create this representation between the text and the main topic based oftentimes on inferences that we make. So, an inference is when readers create information during reading that is not explicitly stated in the text. So we create information during reading that is not explicitly stated in the text itself. There are three major types of inferences. anaphoric, where we connect objects and people, instrumental inferences, where we make inferences about the tools or methods being used, and then causal inferences, where events in one clause are caused by events in the previous sentence or clause. So, for example, this is what you see at the bottom of the slide is some text from an interview with George Foreman, the former heavyweight champion boxer turned grill entrepreneur. And in an interview, he said the following sentence: "We really love to go down to our ranch. I take the kids out and we fish. And then, of course, we grill them." Now, technically, "we grill them" could refer to either the fish or the children. It's sort of ambiguous language. This would be the type of language that you would not want to use in a formal setting. This is perfectly fine because it's just a conversation, right? It's an interview. And so we all understand that "we grill them" refers to grilling the fish, right? Because we're making an inference about the text, about the context, about the meaning. If you're reading this interview, you know that it's with George Foreman, that they're talking about his grill and the sales of his grill and how much he loves to grill food, not grill children. Right. So we take the sort of grander meaning and context of the story itself, of the interview, and we use it to inform and make inferences about the meanings of particular phrases or sentences in the text. We also make physical representations of what the text is about, and we tend to do so from the point of view of the protagonist, so the point of view of the story. So I like this example here on the left. People were shown this image of two nails, a vertical nail and a horizontal nail. And then they were read either one of two sentences or heard one of two sentences. "He hammered the nail into the wall," or "he hammered the nail into the floor." And they were asked to choose which nail corresponded with which sentence. Now, technically, it doesn't matter. You can nail you can hammer a nail into a wall from above, right? You can hammer a nail into the floor from the side. You can hammer a nail from almost any direction, right? If you're building a house or doing some repairs or tearing down walls, right? You have access to all these different angles. Nothing says that hammering a nail into a wall must be done horizontally, but it's most obvious that it's done horizontally. And so, in the context of a typical narrative story, the horizontal nail goes with the sentence, "He hammered the nail into the wall." And the vertical nail goes with the sentence, "He hammered the nail into the floor." Because we assume when someone's hammering a nail into a wall that they're maybe hanging up a picture. And so they're going to be nailing it from their perspective horizontally. And we assume that when someone's hammering a nail into the floor, right, maybe they're replacing a board in the floor. So they're on their hands and knees. They're hammering down vertically into the floor from the protagonist's perspective. So as we read these sentences, we put ourselves almost in the shoes of whoever "he" is, right? The subject of this sentence, "he." We put ourselves into their shoes and we imagine this sentence from their perspective, leading to this inference about the direction of the nail. And so when the orientation of the nail matches sort of the expectation, then people respond more quickly than when the orientation of the nail sort of does not match people's expectations. Additionally, there are changes in our brain as we start to interpret the meaning of words. Um, so we can see that um, we have two sentences here. The cats won't eat, blah, 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 or the cats won't bake, blah, blah, blah. The cats won't eat is going to be a sort of um, meaningful sentence, right? The word eat fits in this sentence. This is fine. The cats won't eat when no one is home, right? Whatever. But the word bake in reference to something cats won't do is odd. The cats won't bake. It's difficult to imagine an ending of that sentence that makes sense, right? It'd have to be something odd, like the cats won't bake in the summer sun if we keep them inside. Like, it's just a very strange, unexpected sentence, right? It's not an easy one or a common one. And so when when the fourth word in this sentence doesn't fit our expectation, like the word bake, we get a different response in the brain, right? This is an ERP. This is sort of the magnitude of a brain's response in a particular location when hearing this word. So the unexpected word bake produces a different pattern of brain activity than maybe the expected word eat. One thing that I find extremely interesting is that our perception of action words actually overlaps with the areas of the brain that are used for movement uh, of those sorts of actions. So people made movements with their feet, their finger, or their tongue. And you can see the areas of the brain that controlled foot for blue for foot, red for finger, green for tongue. And then people heard action words about legs, arms, or the face. And we can see, obviously, it's not perfect, but the sort of blue areas are similar for the hearing the action words as are the areas for moving your legs, and the red areas for hearing words about arms are similar to the areas of actually moving your arms, and the areas of green for hearing words about faces are similar to the areas of the brain for actually making movements of your something in your face, your tongue. So there seems to be this sort of reciprocal relationship between uh, actual physical embodiment of movement, and then our interpretation of hearing about movements of those bodies. Our brain is actually mapping these two things onto each other, not perfectly, but it's sort of co-opting the areas to do two jobs at once. So now we'll move briefly into a discussion of conversation. Conversation is interesting. Obviously, it's defined as two or more people speaking together. But conversation is interesting because it's so dynamic and rapid. Conversation sort of ebbs and flows, often seamlessly and quickly, moving from one topic to the next, maybe involving additional people. And then those people sort of fall out of the conversation, and then new people come in. Those people fall out of the conversation, and then the topic changes, and people almost get into this sort of dance with each other as they have conversations. There's an element of sort of give and take and back and forth and synchrony between people. There are the dynamics here that are really quite interesting. The first is known as a given new contract. Um, this is sort of an idea about the way that people should construct sentences within a conversation that we all implicitly possess, but we might not actually know that we're doing this. So, what this means is that at the beginning of a conversation, when a conversation starts, it includes information. That information is known as the given information because it can be taken as a given that the people in the conversation know and understand that information because it's already been talked about, it's already been discussed, so it's given. uh, and then every subsequent sort of segment of speech or new person that's speaking adds new information. And what people do is they construct new sentences such that they include and reference the given information, but then they add new information. So, for example, we let's imagine that you sit down with a friend to have a cup of coffee, and that friend says, "Oh yeah, I'm just on my way to this meeting. I've got just a few minutes, and I'm happy to sit and hang out. But yeah, I'm on this way to a really important meeting." And maybe in a couple sentences, what you would say is something like, "Oh, I know you've got that important meeting, but you just have to listen to this song that I heard today. I know you've got that meeting, but just give me 1 minute to show you this song I heard." What you're doing is you're referencing the given information. You're saying, "I heard you. I understand that you have a meeting to go to. We are partners in that information." You're acknowledging the given information, and then you're adding new information. "Hey, I want you to listen to this song." And so what you're doing is you're telling the other person, "I'm acknowledging what you have said, and I'm incorporating that into what I'm saying, and I'm incorporating that into what I would like out of this conversation." And so the conversation becomes collaborative. And so what ends up happening is people find what's called common ground, um, which is this sort of shared knowledge and belief among conversation partners. So the two people at the coffee shop understand, they have the shared knowledge that the first person uh, is on a time crunch. They're going to have to leave soon because they have an important meeting. And so then everyone might produce the belief of, well, then we should keep this conversation relatively short, right? We need to keep things moving. Maybe we have a couple points to hit, a couple things to say, but we need to move fast. We need to keep it up because we share this sort of common ground. And another interesting piece of common ground is called entrainment, where conversation partners will get into this synchronization and coordination of their speech, also called syntactic coordination, where they'll use similar grammatical constructions. They'll start sort of mimicking each other's manner of speaking and way of constructing sentences as a way of perhaps increasing the sort of social contract and collaboration of the conversation. And we know this. There are actually experiments on syntactic priming that show us that the use of a specific grammatical construct by one person increases the uh, chances that other people will use that same construct in the conversation in the future. So, um, in experiments that have tested this, people are set up sort of in the same room, um, and they have this sort of these decks of cards on a table, and they're sort of describing the scenes that they see on these cards. And what ends up happening is that if one person uses a particular structure of a sentence, the girl gave the boy a book, then the next person is more likely to use a similar construction on a completely different sentence, the father gave his daughter a present. Notice that if you were to describe these scenes, you could describe them in any number of ways, right? You could say here, the girl is returning the boy's book. You don't have to say the girl gave the boy a book. You could say the girl is returning the boy's book. But if one person used this construction, the girl gave the boy a book, then when a similar situation comes up, like this father and his daughter with a present, this person is likely to use a similar construction. The father gave his daughter a present, even though you could easily describe this as the father and daughter are sharing a present, right? The father and daughter found a present. This sort of matching of the syntactic structure is very common. You might have also heard of something similar to this called the chameleon effect. It's basically the same effect, but for body language. So if two people are in a conversation and one person scratches their nose, the other person is more likely to scratch their nose. And this is actually an important piece of conversation, right? Nonverbal communication. Things like gestures, facial expressions, tone of voice sort of can set the stage for a conversation, can become a really important part of how people interpret conversation. Imagine, someone who is an incredibly close friend of yours maybe says something sarcastic that could otherwise be interpreted as mean, but they do it with like that a sly smile, right? That they're just telling a joke. They're just giving you a hard time. And so their nonverbal communication is telling you, hey, I'm not really being mean. I'm just having fun here. And I know that we're friends. And so I know that we can sort of pick at each other and have fun. And so this nonverbal communication becomes part of the broader context in which we use to interpret language. Another really important ability for uh, interpretation of conversation is something called theory of mind. If you've taken developmental psychology in particular, you've probably heard of theory of mind. This ability develops in sort of early mid childhood, where we begin to understand what other people can feel, think, or believe. So, your friend who tells a sarcastic joke might be able to see that they hurt your feelings, whether through your verbal communication or your nonverbal communication. They can make an assumption about your mind, right? Your feelings, your beliefs, and maybe they make their joke. They give their little sarcastic jab to you. They notice that you don't respond very well, right? You maybe feel and you maybe look a little hurt, and so they follow it up with something like, hey, no, I'm just joking, that I wasn't being serious. Because what they've done is, in essence, they've read your mind, right? They have made an assumption about what you feel, think, or believe. And so this having a theory of someone else's mind becomes a critical component of conversation. And with our last couple of slides here, we'll briefly discuss some similarities between music and language. Music shares some common ground with the mechanics of language. In particular, there's an idea of prosody in spoken language, and prosody is the rhythm, the intonation, the pitch of someone's voice. And prosody is one of the things used by very dynamic speakers to produce emotion. So think about one of my favorite examples is Martin Luther King Jr.'s "I Have a Dream" speech. Right, he builds and maintains emotion with this very rhythmic and big and bold and what you might call soaring, right? Sort of essence of his voice that takes on almost a musical quality, right? It becomes, in a sense, a piece of music, and we know that music um, creates emotion through sound in a very similar manner, right? You can listen to a song or hear an instrument play, or even hear, maybe a good example would be to hear someone sing in another language. And even though you don't speak that language, you can probably take a guess as to, is this a sad song? Is this a happy song? Is this person feeling heartbroken? Is this person feeling excited? Even though you don't understand the language, because the music can sort of take on this similar quality of rhythm and intonation that spoken language does, in prosody. And so language can actually take advantage of both the words that are being said and the musical tones that it uses to really create this rich, structured sequence of emotion that can be manipulated and unfold over time. One great example is sort of from the very basics of music theory, is returning to sort of the starting point of a chord or of a tone. So if we take just a very simple song, like, twinkle twinkle little star, how I wonder what you are. What makes this so pleasing is that we start here. I believe this is a C. I believe that's the note here. We start here at a C, and we sort of work our way up a little bit, and then we step our way back down, and we end at the same note. We end on a C. And so it feels round, right? It feels complete. It makes us feel good. It makes us feel satisfied, right? To finish back on this C. But now I want us to stop at the word you. So, twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I wonder what you. And that's it. You're done. If you stop at you, what happens? You get this unresolved feeling, right? You're like, no, you're not done yet. You need to finish, right? You need to resolve the melody, is what we call this in music. And so you need to resolve the melody by finishing back on, in this case, the same note, R. And what that does is it then provides that sort of round emotion. Um, in music and music theory, you don't have to. This roundness can be achieved in many ways. It doesn't have to be by ending exactly back on the same note. If you're talking about chords, there are different chord progressions that can give you a similar sort of effect. But this is just a very simple explanation and example of it with a simple little melody like "Twinkle Twinkle Little Star." And so let's put this back into the context of language. If just notes and the noises that those notes make can produce this sort of these very different feelings of emotion, then imagine the power that language can have when language combines both the meaning of the words with these sort of elements of emotionality from music into something like the Martin Luther King "I Have a Dream" speech, right? And it becomes this, worldwide and historical phenomena, both um, because of what he's saying and because of the way in which he's saying it. It requires all of those elements sort of coming together to form this thing that's where the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, in a sense. All right. Well, that's it for chapter 11 on language. Thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.